Welcome to Lawyerpreneur, where we discuss the alternate paths that allow lawyers to engage their entrepreneurialism and distinguish themselves from others, because being a lawyer doesn't have to mean doing business as usual. I'm your host, Jeremy Richter. Today's episode is brought to you by Alps Insurance, the nation's largest direct writer of lawyers' malpractice insurance. Founded for lawyers by lawyers over 30 years ago, Alps works directly with your firm, no broker or agent, and if you do have a claim, the Alps claims handling team is comprised of actual attorneys, all with private experience. Alps roots for the law firms they protect. They believe in your success and nurture your endeavors with industry-leading coverage, risk management resources, and accredited CLEs, offering practical advice for pioneering lawyers like you. And Alps has the slickest online application out there. Qualifying firms can apply, see rates, and bind coverage in about 20 minutes. Right now, you can get 25% off one CLE seminar from Alps. Go to alpsinsurance.com/CLE. That's ALPS insurance.com/CLE and use the promo code Lawyerpreneur upon checkout. In addition to the corporate sponsorship that helps pay for the hosting and transcription of the show, you can support Lawyerpreneur on Patreon at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. For less than the cost of a .1, you can help pay for the time it takes in creating and editing Lawyerpreneur and receive copies of my two most recent books, Stop Putting Out Fires and Level Up Your Law Practice. Now, on to the interview. My guest today is Claire Parsons. She is a local government and school law attorney in Kentucky. She is on the board of directors for Mothers Esquire, and she writes frequently on mindfulness and mindset topics, which is what we are here to talk about today. Claire, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so I want to establish kind of a framework for what we're talking about with mindset and mindfulness, because I think there are a lot of maybe preconceived notions and misconceptions about what that is, and I think we'll get into some of that. But what are those topics, and why do they matter?
So I would differentiate mindset from mindfulness. I generally when I present on this issue, I define it, and I use the definition from Jon Kabat-Zinn. Because it's got all the elements that us lawyers tend to like. So it's awareness in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So that non-judgmental piece, where you're not pushing away or pulling in anything, where you're not clinging but not resisting, but also just being where you are right now and seeing what is there. And that's important because us lawyers know if a client calls us and rattles off a complicated fact pattern, we have to call them and kind of triage the situation, figure out really what are the salient facts, and then we can decide what to do. Most of us in our daily lives, we kind of go through it so quickly that we miss some of the salient facts. And so when we go back to what's really, really there right now, we can make wiser decisions in the future. Mindset is really more your frame of mind or your state of mind, and that's a piece of mindfulness too. There's a lot of discussion in mindfulness text, even in the ancient text, about attitude and right behavior and all of that. So that's a piece of it, but it's not quite the same thing.
When you talk about mindfulness and not being judgmental, I think you're probably talking, or I guess maybe I should phrase this as a question. Are you talking about not being judgmental toward ourselves and the space that we're in?
In part, some of it is, so mindset, the big mindset that's important with mindfulness is usually compassion. And part of that is self-compassion. So it's generally looking at things with a friendly attitude. Instead of seeing things in a negative light, you see them more in a positive light, or at least a friendly light, non-hostile. And so some of that process with mindfulness is continually bringing up compassion for yourself and others, because as you push into life and as you go through it, you're going to come through bad things. That's why mindfulness exists as a practice, because suffering exists in the world. But to get through that without resistance and without a lot of struggle, you have to keep offering little doses of compassion for yourself and others as you move through it. So that's part of it. But non-judgmental is really more, you're never going to get to a point unless you become enlightened where you're not forming judgments about what's going on in your life. It's more being aware of the judgments and seeing if you can just not get tangled up in them so that you can actually see what's going on instead of always seeing it through the lens of a judgment.
That's really interesting. All right. So what are sometimes those concepts feel really abstract to me. I know you talked about it in realistic terms there, but what are some ways that you practice that in your daily life where, just on kind of a more down to earth level here?
So that's exactly true. And that's a really important point. When a lot of people start with mindfulness, they read maybe about a scientific study that talks about the benefits for it, or they pick up an app and they start doing it. A lot of what you learn with mindfulness is through experience. And that's, in fact, what mindfulness is trying to get you to do. It's trying to get you to focus on your real experience in life instead of your thoughts about life. Not that your thoughts aren't important, but sometimes your thoughts are wrong. Sometimes, frankly, my thoughts are crazy. And it's not until I get out of them that I realize that's a terrible idea. Why would I ever think that? Because that's what your mind does. So it's really getting back to that experience. And that's the important thing. And I'm sorry, I maybe got a little sidetracked from your question. Could you get me back on track with that?
Yeah, sure. What are some ways that you practice mindfulness just on a daily basis?
Yeah, so it all the time. What tends to happen and what a lot of people struggle with initially is that they're not good meditators. And I've been doing it about 8 years, and I can tell you I'm not a good meditator. Every time I get on that cushion, it could be a great experience or it could be a struggle. The point of the practice is not to be good at the practice, it's to be good at life. So what you start to see is once you practice for a while, it kind of comes out in daily life. One of the first things I noticed is I got fewer neck and headaches and things. And I realized that those were stress-induced headaches. So just by calming down, I got less headaches. I noticed I would go to the grocery store, and instead of rushing through the store like a maniac on a mission, I would walk and actually notice other people. I might even smile at them. I might hold the door for someone or assist someone if I saw, I'm a tall person, so I might get something off a shelf for somebody who's shorter, those kind of things. And they're very small, but they come up. I know times where, I remember one time I was walking in the house and I got a text message from my husband. And I started to react to it because, wives sometimes do that. And he showed up right at the house like 2 minutes later. And by the time he got there, I had already decided I'm going to let this lie. And so a fight just didn't happen. So it's sometimes those very small instances where they can change your life, but you start to notice them and see them. And that's because you've been practicing it. So you just start to do these things throughout your life.
All right. So you mentioned that you've been meditating for about 8 years. Why did mindfulness, and I assume that's just a part of your practice, why did it become important to you?
It became important to me because it worked. How I got there was very random and circuitous. I was a philosophy major in college, and I just didn't really know much about Asian philosophy. I happened to be stuck at a Barnes and Noble one night with my family, wandered into the philosophy department, found a book on Buddhism, and realized I didn't know much, so I picked it up. It sat around my house on a bookshelf for about 2 years. When I finally read it, I thought this made a lot more sense than almost any other argument I read in philosophy in college. And so I resolved that I would start meditating. 1 to 2 years later, I actually did. At the time when I started doing it, I was very busy. I had a 2-week wrongful death trial coming up out of town. It was a big deal. I was so busy, I couldn't see straight. And so at the time I started sitting just to hang on to my life and not lose my mind. And I started with 1 or 2 minutes a day. In retrospect, I now see that I kind of really needed it. Just before that, I had my first daughter. It was a very difficult pregnancy. I had postpartum depression. She was small, and then I couldn't breastfeed her when she got out. So I had a lot of shame and judgment and all that stuff. And I really didn't need to respond that way, but I did. And so when I started meditating, I wasn't looking for self-compassion, but I think that's really what I found once I got into the practice a little bit more. And that is what transformed my life and helped me unpack a lot of the little things that I was doing to beat myself up or hold myself back. And once I did that, my career and just my own happiness, it just changed completely.
That's really interesting. That's really, affirming and helpful. One of the ways, and I don't think this may be more mindfulness or mindset than mindfulness, but one of the ways I have, 2 years for me, 2 years ago in 2018 was really a year of self-assessment for me, and a lot of reading about being an introvert and, just personality typing and that sort of thing that just gave me a lot of insight into who I am and how I function. And one of the things I realized about myself that was really obvious once I did some paying attention to it was that where this sort of thing strikes me is that I have what an author I like to read calls comparisonitis, or, in Old Testament terms, it's just envy. When I see my peers who, get recognition for something when, I might not be getting it, or doing things that I haven't done, or just having accomplishments that I haven't had, and trying to compare myself against them, even if it's not something that I particularly want to have done, but just the recognition that comes along with it, instead of being mindful of where I'm at in my journey and what I want out of various things. So I guess that's a long way of just saying, like, are there different ways that, you mentioned needing self-compassion and coming upon it in this way. And for me, it's just what I described. Do people, are they affected by different things and receive different things out of their own mindfulness and paying attention to themselves?
Absolutely. And actually, there's a couple different ways to answer this question. First of all, the science will tell you that the type of meditation you practice you use will dictate the outcomes you get. So at first, they found all this evidence that mindfulness has all these benefits. And then scientists got confused because one study would indicate that they got one benefit, but not another. And then another one contradicted that. And they finally figured out that the different practices determine what you get. So if you do a breath practice all the time, you're going to probably get increased focus. If you do loving kindness meditation, that's actually one of the really promising ones. That's the one that can induce compassion and help you with your interpersonal relationships. So science tells you that you're going to get different outcomes. I tend to like a mix. I do body scan, I do loving kindness, and I do Vipassana, which is insight or breath style meditation. But you can do any number of them, and it's great to experiment and try and mix it up. But like the reality is, I also don't think that mindfulness is the only way you go about developing yourself as a person or helping yourself. I use my Peloton bike for my mental health. I use my kids. I use my friends. I've gone to therapy on occasion when it is necessary. And I tell people to do that because there's no shame in it. And it's really been a gift every time I've done it. You need all of these different things. And I just think stress and I think these emotions and suffering in life are things that you need multiple different arrows in your quiver to be able to combat them. But for me, and it's interesting that you mentioned the comparisonitis when you have written 2 books and you have your own blog and a podcast. And I do some of the same things too. I don't necessarily compare myself, but I get into the mode where I do one thing and then I have to go on to the next thing, and it's almost never enough. And so it's that recognition. And in fact, like there's an ancient word that the Buddha would have used to describe this thing, and it's called dukkha, which sounds a lot like dookie, and I think that's appropriate. And that's suffering. That's this never-ending wheel of suffering where we just don't get satisfied with anything. And so being aware of that and just acknowledging, like sometimes when I'm doing that to myself, I'm just like, oh, that's dukkha. And I see it, and it sort of helps me get out of it. It doesn't mean it goes away, but it helps.
Yeah. And I think for me, part of it is I'm very intrinsically motivated, and I'm always looking forward at what's next, and accomplishments have very little resonance with me. And it's always just like, okay. And I think in my most recent book, Level Up Your Law Practice, I even wrote in there that like, I know that when I finish this book, I'm going to be done with it and put it behind me, and it's on to the next thing. And I'm not actually going to take any time to celebrate the having done it. It'll just be like, okay, that's done. What's next? And jump into the next thing. And so, I can see it. I don't always take the time to endeavor to make a change, but I'm glad you mentioned exercise, your Peloton, because that's one of the places that's really been helpful to me. A few months ago, I had David Kempston on the show, and he's a lawyer up in, I think I'm going to get it wrong. It's either Minnesota or Wisconsin, and I can never keep those two straight. But he talked about, for him, running is what he describes as a restorative place. And for me, it was one of the catalysts for during quarantine for me starting running again, because I used to do it several years ago and then just got out of the practice. But also creativity. And I have started, and I haven't even, I hesitate to even talk about it because am about 30,000 words into what will be the first novel that I've finished. And writing it has been one of the most fun experiences that I have had recently. Not that it's easy, but after I've written, 1,000 or 1,500 words of a scene, just having done it has just been such a fun experience that I am in a better mental place just for having exerted that creativity and just kind of unleashed something that, I pulled out of nowhere seemingly. And so, I really think exercise and creativity are really important aspects of just having a positive outlook on things.
I think you're right. And I think science will say that. Like I run occasionally, but I mean, I mostly just like to move. And it was something for me that was really lacking. Like after I had my kids, I was active as a kid. I grew up in basketball shorts. So I was always playing sports year round. And then I kind of fell away from it in college, and things like that. And I didn't realize that it was something that was kind of missing for me. And so now once I got started again, now I do it almost every day. And if I don't, I miss it. And it's interesting though, because my mindfulness practice really helped with that, because a few years ago, after I had my second daughter, I finally got back into working out and I lost a lot of weight, and I needed to, but I had to start very slowly. And so when I started, I was going to Orange Theory at first, I was running on the tread, and I'd never been a runner. And I started using SelfCompassion meditations on my treadmill to get through my all out intervals. And, it's amazing how much that is much more effective than beating yourself up and judging yourself for what you can't do yet. And now I just do that automatically. And those Peloton instructors, they're smart. They know that if you have a good time and enjoy yourself, you'll come back. And so they're always uplifting and they're always telling you to pay attention to you. So I really think the fun piece of it and the creative piece of it is a thing that a lot of lawyers forget, because we're interested in focusing on other people. But I've actually just wrote an article on this for DRI recently about it doesn't make a lot of sense, and I can't explain how it works. But when I started actually just doing things because I liked them, my practice got better. I don't understand how that works, but it did. And so that piece, and I don't know if it's just you're happier and so you're not worrying so much and you're just doing the, following your passions, and maybe there's some truth to that, but it's been my experience. And it's just a happier way to live.
Yeah. Well, I think that an important part of this discussion, since we're lawyers and the audience is lawyers, is that when the topic turns to mindfulness and mindset and meditation and self-compassion, those are words or ideas that I think a lot of lawyers will just nope right out of that discussion. They're not interested in having it. And I think some of that is, it seems to woo-woo, or, immediately somebody like Tony Robbins comes to mind, who is over the top, and they just a lot of lawyers assume that I don't want anything to do with this. Is that something that you've run into?
It was something I worried about. And on a couple, I present on mindfulness and I write about it. So on a couple like evaluation sheets, I've had a few like nasty comments like this isn't applicable or I don't like this or whatever. But for the most part, no. For the most part, people have been really receptive. And I live in Kentucky. I don't live in San Diego. I'm not. So I live in Northern Kentucky. It is actually the most conservative part of the state of Kentucky. And people have been really receptive to it. It's kind of interesting how I started actually presenting on mindfulness 2 years ago. My Chamber of Commerce has a women's initiative and they had a regional summit. And I had really not told anybody that I even meditated. When I first started, I told my husband I was taking a nap and he finally was like, "You've been taking a lot of naps. Like, are you okay? You never take naps." And then finally I admitted that I was meditating. And he thought I was weird at first, but he didn't care. And he even like a couple times when I went on retreats, he watched the kids and it was not a big deal because he saw that I was happier and I was yelling less and, I was doing things I enjoy. So he tolerated it. But I started presenting and the first time I did, I was in front of rooms of, packed rooms of women who I didn't know who walked in and said, "How many times have you done this before?" And I was like, "Never." But they were hungry for it. They wanted it and it went really well. And so then I turned it into a CLE for lawyers. I was terrified about talking to particularly male lawyers about these issues. I went down and talked to defense lawyers for Kentucky Defense Council, in which I'm involved. And one guy from the audience, an older guy, came up and said, "I went up to the Cincinnati Zen Center back in the 70s, Claire." So we had a fun conversation about that. And a lot of them, they really liked it. I did loving kindness practice in that. And I was a little worried about it. And I warned them, I said, "You may not like this. You may think it's weird, but it's just so effective." And to not include it when you talk about mindfulness is really what people need. Americans just don't learn self-compassion. And if you learn about it and how much it really is effective and how it can keep you steady, I couldn't not use it. And so I'm willing to take that risk, but for the most part, people have been quite amazing and receptive to it.
So I was listening to, it's funny you said that about being weird because I can really identify that with that. My wife has, from the outset of when I started doing the blogging and writing 4 years ago, was like, "You know what? Like, I don't get it. I don't understand why you need to do it, but whatever." So I can really identify with that. And then about going back to being weird, there's a podcast that's fairly new that I've started listening to. It's called People I Mostly Admire. And the host is Steve Levitt, who is one of the co-authors of the book series Freakonomics. And he had on his show Ken Jennings, who is, I think, like the winningest Jeopardy player ever. And he said on that episode, Ken Jennings said, "Don't neglect the thing that makes you weird." And I just really appreciated that. And, I feel like a lot of the things that make me different and weird are things that I've really leaned into in the last 4 years. And, I've just really enjoyed all that's come with it. And I think it's made me have a more fulfilled experience in, the things that aren't work, because I'm happier having done them and spending the time doing them in the early morning hours before the kids are awake. But I also think that it's made me a better lawyer and that it's actually to help grow in some ways my law practice. And that wasn't, in some ways it was the intent, but it worked out differently than I would have expected. It certainly opened me up to having broader and deeper networks of people and being involved in communities that I otherwise wouldn't have. What is your own experience? And you talked about it a little bit, but how has it affected your law practice?
So, yeah, just the weird thing. I can't not comment on that and bring this up. Like I've felt, I think for most of my life, like I didn't fit in some way. Like I was kind of a dork in school always. Like you can't tell. Like I'm a philosophy major and I like pick up a book on Buddhism for no reason. So I mean, it's pretty clear. Like I've always been kind of a nerd. I'm an introvert too. I'm argumentative. Like I'm, on the agreeable, disagreeable scale. Will you disagree with a stranger? Yeah, I will. I mean, I'm a lawyer. So, and so I've never been Miss Popularity, and I've never just said what what people want me to say. And so I struggled for a long time. And finally, even in the last 5 years, I realized that feeling like you don't fit in, it means you stand out. And that's really a call to be who you are, because that's what the world needs. And I'm not saying like you should, be in everybody's face all the time and you need to not care about people's feelings. I think you do, but that is how you actually find community. I think that we have a pandemic of loneliness in the West, and it may be worldwide, because I think many of us are watching what is on the internet and trying to emulate that. Instead of seeing what's out there, mixing it with us, coming up with something weird and new and celebrating it. When I learned to do that, that was where I just found people like me. Like recently, I just wrote an article on LinkedIn about networking and mindfulness. So LinkedIn and mindfulness, and most people would say social media and mindfulness do not go together at all. But I did, and I got some good feedback to it, and I found some new people that I otherwise wouldn't have met. Like I love mixing things together that don't go. And the way that they fit is they fit in me. And if I can interpret them for other people and help them see something new or see it in a funny way, that's me being myself. And that's providing value to other people too, because then you open their eyes or maybe just touch their heart, and that's okay. And I think that works because people can sense when you aren't comfortable with yourself. So one of the reasons I talk about all the nasty stuff, like I've written about my difficult pregnancy, I've written about anxiety, about being an introvert, I've written about all that stuff because it helps me claim my story. I take that shame away. They can't call me any names that I haven't already called myself and written about in public. So once I do that, I completely own my story. I know it, and they can't catch me off guard. And the other thing is I build a community around me because they know what I'm about and they're behind me. And so I think that's why it works.
And I think that authenticity it's hugely important. It's something that I recently talked about with Alex Sue, is just being who you are in public, and whether that's in the form of writing or presenting and talking about these things, gives you an opportunity to really resonate with people, to help people, and to get personal with people in a way that you might not otherwise have that chance. And I think that, certainly the way that we've been able to interact with other lawyers and clients and potential clients has changed in the last 7 months. And I think I've talked about this on here before, I've had personal conversations with clients in the last 7 months that I had never had before, just talking about our experiences and being vulnerable, but not in a way that's inappropriate. Just, we all have this common shared experience right now that we didn't have before. Everybody was maybe in, my adjusters that I work with are spread out all over the country, doing different things, but we all now have this one shared experience that has dominated our existence. And I think that the ability to have conversations about the difficult things lets you identify with people that in ways that otherwise wouldn't have. And it can create depth even in your work relationships that adds a loyalty and builds trust that you can't have just by keeping it business all the time.
I would agree. And actually, so I really appreciated my school clients in the last few months, because when I had my kids run in or throw a fit on the phone, one time I had my 4-year-old run in when I was on the phone with a client, and she said, "I threw up." And so then she did it the next day. So my client asked, "How are you, Eleanor? Are you feeling better?" So, I had a lot of new clients this year. I got 4 new school district clients within the firm, and 2 of which I'm the primary point of contact. And then I had 1 client move on, an established client, but a new person in the role I work with a lot. So I had a lot of new relationships, and I was learning people in the midst of a pandemic. And I tell you that, this situation that we're all living through, at first I was worried about what it would do since I wouldn't have the in-person contact, but it's been helpful for getting to know them as real people and not just as professionals.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place to leave off. So if people want to find you and follow you, where can they do that?
LinkedIn is the best place. I am on Twitter, but LinkedIn is the best place. Find me at Claire E. Parsons on LinkedIn. There is another lady named Claire Parsons who is a content writer and does hilarious GIFs. So if you want to learn how to use GIFs on LinkedIn, follow her. But Claire E. Parsons is me on LinkedIn. And then I also have a YouTube channel because I just created some guided meditations. Many of them are related to lawyers as well. You can find me at Claire E. Parsons there too. But Jeremy, I'll send you the link after we're done, so you can put that on your show notes if you like.
Yeah, I'll be glad to do that. All right. Well, thanks for your time.
All right. No problem.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Please take time to rate and subscribe at whatever podcatcher you're listening on. And if you want more from me, you can find me at jeremywrichter.com. You can also find me on Twitter at RichterJW. And if you want the extra audio and benefits available at Patreon, you can become a patron at patreon.com/lawyerpreneur. Thanks for listening.